All right, folks, let's dive in and get started. Appreciate you joining me this Friday. I always love when people come out and watch these webinars and get involved. If you haven't been to one of my webinars before, I like to keep a unscripted conversation going. So over on the left, excuse me, you'll see a Q&A box. Feel free to type in any questions as we go. If I don't get to your question during the webinar, I'll definitely address it afterwards. So we're going to take a little bit of a different tone today. I see a few returning people in here, but most of my webinars focus on demonstrating how RIAs and hedge funds get hacked, where we'll actually go in and take a look at from a hacker's perspective and how they're viewing your firm and how they're going to launch an attack. Today, we're going to take a step back and look at the documentation that the SEC wants to see when they come in and do an examination. And during this webinar, you're going to hear me, I reference the SEC a lot just because that's the majority of what my clients are. It's SEC registered, that is. Most of the same applies for FINRA and also for the state board registered firms as well. You guys in Florida and New York actually have a little bit more stringent requirements in the SEC mandates. But anyway, we're going to walk through that and take a look at some real world examples of what the SEC has requested before they come and do an examination or audit and how you can respond to that. I'm going to show you a few tools that I use when I go out and I do this work for my clients. Those of you that are somewhat tech savvy can use these tools as well to do it within your firm. So for you guys that don't know me or haven't been to a webinar before, my name is Brian Hahn. I'm the founder here at mTradeCraft. I've been running mTradeCraft for about 10 years with a couple year breaks in there as I stepped into CCO roles and launched a RIA at one point. But I've been in the finance industry for about 20 years, both in being a trader and running trading desk for hedge funds and IT operations for hedge funds. Spent some time at Ray Dalio's Bridgewater Associates up in Connecticut, and then also sitting in the CCO role and a director of operations role for RIAs. So a lot of my knowledge and viewpoints come from not only having this skill set and going and doing the cybersecurity work and pen testing work, but also how I combine that with my work and making sure that a firm could respond to the SEC. I think it's interesting to mention here, one of them, if you see my writings before, one of the biggest problems we have is that the SEC doesn't really make much of a differentiation between Fortune 500 firms and, small advisors that are needing to meet their compliance obligations and cybersecurity obligations. So, you'll see a lot of my opinion in this where we take something that the SEC says and think about how to respond to that. I'm going to show you some examples today, but it's by no means kind of the set in stone way to do it. Each firm is going to be a little bit different. If you are a billion-dollar firm and you're using Microsoft Azure to launch virtual machines for your employees, you're going to have a whole different set of documentations than, say, a firm that's got 5 employees sitting behind an actual physical laptop. So anyway, I just want to give you an idea of what we kind of look at when we're going through and doing this documentation. So let's talk about some of the recent cybersecurity information that's come out of the SEC and specifically the OC office, which is the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations. So, and don't quote me on dates here, I think it was January, we got this cybersecurity and cybersecurity observations report that came out. It's a pretty decent read, but keeping in general tune of the SEC, it was pretty broad. They kind of give you an idea of what they want to see, but they don't actually tell you how to go about doing that. So I'm going to dive into some of the things that are in this report. And then most recently, we got the cybersecurity safeguarding client accounts against credential compromise. This notice came out on September 15th and dealt with credential stuffing. And if you've seen my other webinars where I demonstrate a pen test, credential stuffing is one of the first attacks that I go to, simply because it's going to allow me to get access to your network. I don't have to phish any of your employees or make any awkward phone calls to your employees. So it helps me be in the shadows. And given that we have a lot of employees working from home now, this type of attack has really stepped up. I've dealt with 3 intrusions so far this week where something was compromised due to leaky credentials. So we're going to dive more in depth about that here in a little bit. And I'm going to show you some of the things that I do to make sure that firms are protected against credential stuffing and brute force attacks. And then back in July, we also got a notification about ransomware, which, again, is another one of those major attack vectors that are coming up. You're going to see it more and more, excuse me, as firms continue to evolve and pull in all this fintech. Unfortunately, bringing in a lot of technology that hasn't really been tested is going to open you up to ransomware and that sort of thing. So, I think especially in this risk alert, the SEC expects these type of attacks to continue, and I agree with them. We're seeing more and more of that. So today, we're going to take a look at a couple different documents that I like to produce for my firms that deal directly with cybersecurity. The first is the IT inventory list. We're also going to go through and make network maps of the local area network, or the LAN. And that map is going to include things like, what desktops, laptops, printers, phones, video conferencing equipment, all these things that connect to the internet in your office. We want to make a map of those. And so that way, when the SEC comes in and says, hey, where is all your information flowing? We got a beautiful map to show them. And it's also a great checklist to go through, as part of your cybersecurity compliance procedures. Once a quarter, at least at a minimum, you should be logging in and looking at the admin portals on these different devices and making sure that they're up to date. So we're also going to build a domain map, which that's going to map how information is flowing through your website, email server, file servers, client portals, etc. One of the things that we're also seeing the SEC request is documentation that you're doing risk assessments and vulnerability scans. So I'm going to go through that and show you how I do that. And then also breach research, where we're looking at past data intrusions. And this is getting back to that credential stuffing attacks that we're seeing. The way I go through and produce this type of report for my clients is the same report that attackers are going to build when they're trying to figure out what credentials are being used in your firm. And then last, we're going to talk about vendor cybersecurity due diligence. So there's also a few compliance documents that I'm not going to cover today. One is your BCP. Whether you have a separate business continuity plan for cybersecurity or you wrap it into your main firm's BCP plan, I don't think that really makes a difference in terms of how the SEC views it. But what's important is that you do have it. Having an employee tech usage agreement in place. And this is an agreement I produce for my firms that, and I'll show you an example here in a second. And if you guys need any of these, just let me know afterwards, and I'm happy to send you a template that you can use within your firm. But I like to have the employee tech usage agreement that I have my employees sign off on at least once a year, usually wrap that into your annual cybersecurity compliance review. And that's going to outline things, how should they be using their mobile phone, not connecting to public Wi-Fi, don't bring USB drives into the office, using secure passwords, all that stuff, all that good cybersecurity hygiene stuff that we want them to follow. Firms also need a cybersecurity policies and procedures manual. I'll show you an example of that here in a second. But I'm not going to dive into too much of it. But, this covers things about what systems are in place, how often should you be logging in and checking those systems. If you're using Office 365 or Google G Suite, what, intrusion report should you be pulling? What audit report should you be pulling and looking through those? That should all be covered in your cybersecurity policies and procedures manual. That's also a manual that needs to go to employees at least once a year and have them sign off that they received it. And then again, kind of thinking about whatever your ecosystem is there, if your infrastructure is Office 365, knowing what reports to pull and putting those in a compliance folder that you can reference during an audit. So here is an example of the firm tech use agreement that I have. I think it's like 8 pages, covers very basic things. Don't share your passwords with other employees. Using web-based email, don't connect to Starbucks Wi-Fi, that sort of thing. How to use hardware and software, how often backups should be handled. These are all the things that I like to include in that technology use agreement that each employee uses. If you're using a password manager like LastPass, you want to define the ideas in here of how you want them to use LastPass and protect it. How they should manage two-factor authentication and all that. So if you want to see a copy of this, just let me know after the webinar, and I'm happy to send it to you. This is the other one that I use, the Cybersecurity Policies and Procedures Manual, and I'll just show you the table of contents of the things that I like to have covered in this policy. So that's the identification of risk and cybersecurity vulnerabilities that might be out there. Access rights and controls. I'm dealing with a problem right now where everybody in the firm was given admin rights in an Office 365 environment. But that should never happen. Accounting shouldn't have access to trading, and trading shouldn't have access to accounting, and that sort of thing. So making sure you have the access rights and controls in place. These are questions that we're seeing the SEC request more and more. How you're protecting your firm's network and information and risk associated with remote customer access and funds transfer requests, should be pretty standard by now, but you shouldn't be taking wiring instructions or, cashiering instructions through email without at least some kind of verbal confirmation with a channel of communications that to be valid for that client. And then risk associated with IT vendors and other third parties, which I'll dive into a little bit here as well. So I want to talk about a community project that I have going on, and I would love for you guys to contribute to it. And I'll definitely pass out a link to this so that you can take a look at it afterwards. But let's see, diving back in, I keep a list. And this is just a copy and paste of different cybersecurity and IT related questions that my clients and people I'm associated with have received from the SEC, FINRA, and state boards. These are generally sent before an examination is going to happen. The SEC likes to see this type of documentation presented to them before they come on, if they come into your firm, so that they have a chance to review it. So it's we got about 10 pages so far of just IT and cybersecurity related requests. So this is going to be kind of the pivot of our conversation today. We're going to take the real world requests that we're seeing coming out of the SEC and talk about ways that, you could meet those demands and produce the documentation that they're wanting to see. So here's our first real world request that we're going to look at. This is basically where the SEC reaches out and say, hey, we want to see a list, an inventory list of all the physical devices and systems that you have connected to the network. And these are going to be systems that in any way touch personally identifiable information. They generally want to see what software platforms and applications you're using, maps of network resources, which I'll show you how we build those maps here in a second. And who's connecting to the firm, external sources, cataloged and assessed. So if you're using an outside IT firm, how are they accessing your firm? Is it remote desktop or TeamViewer or whatever? Making sure that you have that documented. Of course, documenting what protection resources you have in place. Is data encrypted? Are you using two-factor authentication? And of course, what logging capabilities and practices are assessed. So I reference Office 365 a lot. I think that's just the majority of what people are using out there. But the same if you're using G Suite or any of these other kind of ecosystems that come together. But, in Office 365, you need to be going into that admin portal and going into that security portal and running these different audits, looking for things like is email being forwarded outside of the domain, and where are those going, and have any new computers logged on to an account, and if you see that, checking with the employee, hey, did you get a new computer? Why is a new MAC address accessing your account, and that sort of thing. So let's do that. Let's build a couple maps real quick. The first that we'll look at is going to be with a program called Multigo. And I like Multigo a lot because it's a free program. It's basically a fancy mind mapping type program. And it'll give you a little, going backwards here, give you a map that looks like this, kind of looks like a colorblind test. But just to give you the overview of what we're doing here, the idea up here at the top, we want to take the domain name. So that might be something like ABC Wealth Management. Down below, this set of dots are going to be the different servers and systems that are running on that domain. So that can be things like websites, email servers, FTP servers, client portals, all these things that might be tied to that particular domain. Down below those dots are going to be where those domains are located. So that's going to be things like IP addresses. What are the actual IP addresses for those domains? And you can see here, it's kind of interesting. This particular example is a GoDaddy domain. I can't count here. Maybe there's like 12 dots here. There's going to be 12 different IP addresses associated with those domains. And that's pretty normal. Those are going to be fallback IP addresses in case one server goes down or they're doing maintenance on another server, so that way your website is always up. And then down below that, these dots are going to be the actual locations where client data is stored. Again, in this particular example is GoDaddy, and this is the information that the SEC wants to see. If you're running a client portal on your website and that website domain is ultimately held at GoDaddy, potentially GoDaddy has access to sensitive information. So we just want to map that out and be mindful of who has access to that data. So again, up at the top here, I'll just kind of dive in and show you an example of what this looked like. I use glickfinancialservices.com. If you're not familiar with Daniel Glick, he was a fraudster, stole a bunch of money from senior citizens and is now serving, I think, 15 or 20-year prison sentence. So he's a good punching bag for us to talk about. But down below, you can see, here's his top domain. Down below that, we have things like email DNS servers, FTP servers, his admin portal, host of different things over here. If we scroll to the left, we can see things like here was his website. And then down below that, we map all the different plugins or services that he was using on his website. Again, you can see this was GoDaddy. He had the Yoast plugin, which is a search engine optimization plugin on his website. Starfield Technologies, a couple other WordPress plugins, but you want to map these because you want to know, what vulnerabilities might be on these different systems. So if you haven't yet, I highly recommend you register for the CISA weekly vulnerability email that comes out. It's very non-spammy, very matter of fact, but what you do is it's a quick read. You go down it, and it may say something like, we discovered or someone discovered a large vulnerability within the Yoast plugin, and this is a map that would let you know, hey, I've got Yoast on my website. I've got to go in and update that plugin so that someone cannot manipulate my website. So, not only does this meet the idea of what the SEC wants to see in terms of domain mapping, but it's also a great checklist for you to know what you're going to be looking at and in terms of vulnerabilities and how you're going to manage those sort of systems when the vulnerabilities come out. Next, scroll over a little bit more and just show you, kind of how this map is built. And the reason I like Multigo is it's got a lot of these cool little icons and different systems to go in and map this already built in. You can use any mind mapping software for this, but Multigo is free, which is why I liked it. Again, down here, you can see all the different IP addresses that were associated with this domain. They're all going to have the same information on them. These are just fallback servers. Down below that is the range of IP addresses, and then we can go through and further tell that these addresses are registered with GoDaddy, and ultimately that data is sitting in Scottsdale, Arizona. So great way. That's what we call the external domain map. that the SEC likes to see. Again, just mapping things like websites, email servers, client portals. If you're using file servers or file sharing servers, Dropbox, anything like that, that's what we would map on this. So next, I'm going to show you an internal map that we build. And this, again, this report and this system, I use ZenMap to build this. Again, ZenMap just makes this very easy. It's a free program. Anyone can have access to it. And it has a couple purposes that it serves. One is kind of that SEC compliance side of it, where they say, hey, we want to see domain maps. We want to see how data is flowing within the network. ZenMap does a great job of building that map for you right here. So at the center, you have the local host, which would be like your modem or router. And then going around the spokes of the wheel here are going to be the different devices that are connected to that network. So desktops, laptops, VoIP phones, conferencing equipment, Roombas, Ring doorbells, Alexas, whatever you have in your office that's connected to the network, we're going to go out and map it here. Over on the left, you can see a list of different IP addresses. So whenever, and just to give you a little backdrop here, whenever you take a laptop and connect it to your modem or your router is going to assign it an IP address, and that IP address is unique to that particular device. So over on the left here, we map each one of those devices. And if you click on the nmap output file here, this is a network map output. This is going to be the different information that that particular device is giving off. And so what we're interested in knowing, not only from a cybersecurity checkpoint checklist, but also in just a compliance idea, is we want to know what ports and services are open on this particular device. And to give you a quick explanation, ports and services are the things that are running on your computer. They're virtual connections that allow many different things to go on your computer at any one time. For instance, we have port 80, which traditionally connects to HTTP. So if you're web browsing, you're going to see that traffic going out on port 80 or port 443. If you have remote desktop set up and your computer's being accessed from abroad or from someone at home, you're going to see port 3389 and remote desktop open. So the idea is that we need a map of this stuff for one, to show the SEC that, hey, we're actively checking this. But two, just as a cybersecurity checkpoint, going through and looking at the different devices. This particular example doesn't have it, but this is a Windows device. So I'd want to see, does this Windows machine have remote desktop open? If it does, did I authorize it? If I didn't, did that employee violate their employee tech use agreement and open remote desktop, which, by the way, has become a huge attack vector right now, whether it's with ransomware or business email compromise. Remote desktop is the new cool thing to do. So we want to go through and look. As you can see, when I click down the list over here on the left, it's going to tell me about the different systems on the network and what ports and services are open. Right here, you can see this is a Windows machine, and this is port 3389, which is that remote desktop port. So, if I'm a chief compliance officer and I pull this, I'm going to make sure that that machine is one that I gave authorization to have remote desktop open. And further to that, if I leave it clicked on this machine and I click up here on host details, it'll come back and tell me this is a Windows 10 machine. On this particular computer, let's see, I don't think in this particular example it had it. But if you've actually gone through and when you set up a zero or active domain or whatever you're using in your office, if you assign the computer a name, you're going to be able to see that right here. So it would pop up. You can see right here. Here's the name of that computer, gp.local. And so this is just a very easy way to go through and map the different systems that you have on your network. and knowing, what ports and services are open. The other thing I think is pretty cool, this particular scan right here is of a printer. It's an HP OfficeJet 8100, but it even tracks the serial number of that particular device. So again, just a couple different checkpoints that it hits, having that IT checklist, knowing what actual ports and systems are running on your network, and two, just building that domain map for that particular network. And the last thing I'll mention about ZenMap, one thing that I really like is it's super easy. If you have an employee that you have to dismiss, or you hire an employee and you have a new network node coming onto the network, all you have to do is come up here and click scan. It takes about 3 or 4 hours, depending on the size of your network, and it's going to go through and scan and rebuild all of this information for you, so that, in the event of an audit, or you're doing your internal cybersecurity compliance audit, this is super easy to pop up. And you can also, once you do a scan, you can come up here, click save scan, save it. And then when you run another iteration of it, you can compare the two scans. So it might tell you if on John's computer, remote desktop is now open on John's computer. Well, that's a pretty good clue for us to go talk to John and figure out why remote desktop is open. Did he do it? Is there malware running that opened that port for him, and now someone has access to his computer? Anyway, this just provides a great checklist for all of that. So let's look at the next real-world request. This is, please indicate whether the firm conducts periodic risk assessments to identify cybersecurity threats, physical vulnerabilities, or potential business consequences. This is another one I have a fairly big issue with, in how the SEC goes about this topic. If we read, any of the OC releases or any of the notifications that come out of the SEC, generally the language is just left, you need to be performing risk assessments, and they really don't go into more detail about what they're expecting to see. How do you perform these risk assessments? What systems should you be using? So let's talk about a larger idea of what we're looking at when we're going out and trying to figure out risk in our network. I like this. I use this map when I'm talking to clients about doing a penetration test, but we talk about things, the intranet or the local area network is going to be, for instance, your office. So there might be different workstations on it. You might have laptops. You're going to have employees that are using those systems. You may have a file server, print server, FTP, application server. Everyone's got a little bit different infrastructure, but no matter how you're set up here, generally that information is flowing through some switches, some routers, some firewalls. Maybe you have some intrusion detection system or intrusion prevention systems in place, which all connect to the internet, and anyone from the internet could potentially get into this network through this path. The DMZ zone are going to be things like your email, not your email, your web server, your email server, things like that might be sitting out there, available to the internet. Again, each firm's going to be a little bit different here. And now, of course, we have a lot of remote offices going on. So when we're doing a risk assessment, all the things with flags here are the different systems that we want to be looking at. We want to be making sure that there are no new known vulnerabilities for these systems. We want to make sure that they're updated and patched and not just sitting there. One of the biggest problems I see are servers, whether they're file servers. People don't think to log into their server and update the system. If you're using Windows 10 and you get the notification on your laptop that you need to update, I feel like most people are pretty good about hitting that update button, but they might not always be so good at going through and checking the other systems out there. So the product I like is called Nessus, and Nessus does a wide range of vulnerability scans. Let me see if I can actually probably pull up let's see. So I can pull up a live version of Nessus here. But anyway, let me show you what the reports look like ultimately. So this is a Nessus report that comes out. And so what you would do is you would take Nessus, it's a software solution, you would point it to your network, and it's going to go and run a series of scans against everything on your network and look for known vulnerabilities. And that report ends up looking something like this. It'll produce a table of contents. It'll talk about the different vulnerabilities. And then when it finds a vulnerability, it'll give you a little color-coded flag up here. It gives you a synopsis and description of that vulnerability. It's going to give you some outside references. So if you want to look more about what's actually involved in that vulnerability, this is the place to come look for that. And of course, it's going to give you a solution and assign a risk factor. So the risk factor is an important one because what we want is an unbiased risk factor assigned to it, which Nessus does. And the reason we want that is because one of the SEC's comments that they come in and say is we want to see every risk assessment you did that had a high or medium risk factor to it, critical high or medium risk factor associated with it. So it's very important that you have that mapped out for them. Nessus is also going to tell you which systems were affected. It does that by giving you the IP address and the port. So we were looking at ports earlier. It's going to tell you what particular port and service on that network is vulnerable. And then the nice thing too, it gives you a little bit of screenshot about what was going on. In this particular instance, you could see we had 2 systems that had this vulnerability associated with them. And so, whether you do the work yourself or you have an outside IT firm, this is something that you go back to them and say, hey, we got to get this fixed. So this is a report. It's labeled by vulnerability. So it'll tell you the vulnerability and then tell you which systems are affected by that particular vulnerability. I also like to divide it up by host. So up here at the top, you can see this is a particular computer on the network. It's a little color-coded scheme here to tell you about the different vulnerabilities. So on this particular scan, we found 1 medium-ranked vulnerability. And you'll also see 23 what they call infos on here. And a lot of times what those infos are is say you're running a particular server, a Linux server, let's say, and we know that Linux server could be susceptible to 100 different vulnerabilities had it not been patched and updated. Well, as you guys know, anything that is not documented with the SEC didn't happen, is their take on it. So what we want to show is that we're actually testing for these vulnerabilities as well. If we know we have a Linux server and it's potentially susceptible to vulnerability ABC, we want to show where we tested it for vulnerability ABC and that it passed. And so you'll see that a lot in what they call these infos on Nessus. And that'll come through and show you that, hey, we're actively monitoring and we can confirm that these vulnerabilities are not on our system. So again, that's Nessus, NESSUS. It's a great program. I know there's some other vulnerability scanners out there. I'm sure some of them do just as good of a job as Nessus, but I've been using them for quite a few years and have some great things to say about them. They've never failed me. Their tech support's been fantastic. If I ever ran into something that I couldn't figure out, they're definitely there to help. So, just giving a quick shout out for Nessus, but there are other vulnerability scans out there that you can use. So here's another one that we see a lot, and this one gets back to the recent report that we saw out of the OC office regarding credential stuffing. Again, when I'm doing a penetration test on my clients, credential stuffing is one of the first things that I do because that allows me to run a brute force attack on systems using passwords that I found out in the open. I don't have to connect with anyone. I don't have to talk with anyone, which makes it beautiful. So beautiful in terms of hacking, that is. They say, if yes, please provide a timeline and description of the nature of the incident. So I'm going to jump back to Multigo here because I actually use Multigo just for that same purpose. And let me get a little bit wider screen here so you guys can see it. And I'll show you what we're looking at here. So this is how I map out that particular information. Up at the top here, I insert the usernames of my clients, or you would insert the usernames or email addresses of your employees. So again, we're going to use Daniel Glick, Financial Services. So here's danglickfs.com. He was also using the personal email address loanwiz2 at AOL.com. So we take those two emails, and then down below that, in this particular set of dots here, we're going to map the different breaches that we found information in. So what happens, Dropbox was a big one. When I'm going through and doing this research, I like to look at Dropbox, I like to look at Adobe, and I like to look at LinkedIn. Those were three very large breaches that almost everyone in financial services was involved in some point. And so I'll map out the particular breach and give a quick example of what happened in that breach and what was lost. And then down below that, I will map the different information that I was able to locate about those particular users. So as you can see, credit card data, a lot of times we can get credit reports, credit card data, geolocations. So, when you check in on Facebook or Foursquare or whatever the people are using these days, those geographic locations are mapped. So it's pretty easy to tell where you're going. We can often get website activity. So I know what websites you've been visiting, what banks you're using, of course, usernames, passwords, and IP addresses. So as a penetration tester, these are the three things that I really focus in on. If I know your IP addresses, which is the internet address of the systems that you're using, and I know your usernames and I know your passwords, there's a pretty good chance I can get in. So this is where credential stuffing attacks come in. And, when I go through and I'm doing a firm and I've got 20 employees in the firm, and all of a sudden I see that John Smith is using password 123. Guess who my target is? That's the guy I'm going after because he simply doesn't care. So I'll take a program and two, you can also get a lot of information from their passwords about how they structure passwords, which when we're running a brute force attack makes it very convenient. If his password is password 123, I'm going to run through a program that will make 10,000 iterations of that particular password and try to brute force it. So I'll do password 123 with a capital P, password 123 with an exclamation point in it, password 123 where the S's have been replaced with dollar signs. And I can do that in a matter of seconds. And then when I launch my attack, for most systems, I'm running anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 different attempts a minute. So it doesn't take too long to get in, with these credential stuffing brute force attacks. Anyway, I'm getting kind of in the weeds there, but I just want to round out this information for you. So this report right here, where we go through and we map the different breaches, just to summarize, it's got a couple different points to it. For one, when the SEC comes in and makes sure that we're wanting to monitor this, this is how we can show them that we're monitoring it. If you're the CCO, you're going to want to take this report and go to John Smith and be like, John, man, what are you using password 123 for? Didn't you read your employee tech use agreement about using strong, secure passwords? And then, of course, making sure that he's not using that password on another system. So again, the way it kind of works out, if I find his username and his Dropbox password, there's a pretty high chance that he's going to have the same password on his email systems or, whatever systems he may be connected with, or some iteration of that password. Hopefully not. And hopefully you have two-factor authentication in place. I think that's a great side note to make right now. At this point in time and where we are in technology and how much cyber attacks have evolved, you really should not be using a service that does not offer two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is one of the most simple things that you can deploy that will keep, malicious hackers out and penetration testers like me out. When I'm banging on a system and I see that there's two-factor authentication in place, I turn around and go the other way. I'm not even going to attempt it because it's just too darn hard. So. Anyway, that report, again, just kind of two features there. From one, you're going to want to make sure your firm is not susceptible to password stuffing. And two, make sure that when the SEC comes knocking, you can show them, what's going on. Again, I probably should have showed you a slide a minute ago, but it's just this idea that every firm has been involved with a breach, whether they've come into your network directly or not. Over on the right here are a list of some famous breaches. And then over on the left is the information that was lost in those particular breaches. And so, everybody at some points used UPS or LinkedIn or Adobe or eBay or Twitter or, Home Depot, whatever. At some point you guys have been involved in a breach, whether you know it or not. And so these are the kind of maps that we want to build. What can we get out of the different systems? So anyway, beating that one to death. So here's another one, real world request. What are you doing about your vendor cybersecurity risk? And I'm going to show you kind of two different ways that you can approach this. I can tell you right now, we have a very big problem in this industry where fintech and all the different systems that advisors get excited over and firms get excited over, a lot of these projects have been brought to the consumer on a shoestring budget. Maybe they got some venture capital money, but I can tell you right now, an application developer is not a cybersecurity guy, and they're not thinking about cybersecurity as they're building their apps. They're thinking about functionality and ease of use and getting it to market so that they have a viable product. So, back at the beginning, I think on one of my slides, you saw I'm a fintech skeptic. I am a believer in only using fintech technology that has been through a very rigorous cybersecurity testing process. And a lot of companies just have not gone through that process yet. They don't have the workforce. They don't have the budget. It's, doing a penetration test or doing, kind of the cyber audits like I do is one thing. I can do that in a matter of days. But to really go through and test an application for cybersecurity vulnerabilities often takes months, and it's extremely expensive. And so most firms are just not going through that level of detail with the fintech that they put out. So we've got a couple things that we can do about that. The first one I'm going to show you here is, and again, I'm happy to give you this template if you'd like to see it. But I have a vendor confidentiality and cybersecurity agreement. And so what I found when I was in the CCO role is that, if I contacted a vendor and said, hey, what cybersecurity documentation do you have? Can you send it to me? Oftentimes they drag their feet, they're dragging their knuckles, they're not wanting to send it to me. Maybe the account manager just simply doesn't know, he doesn't want to address it, whatever the case may be. It always just felt like pulling nails to try to get that information out of them. So I came up with this one pager. I say one pager, it's actually a couple pagers here, but just this one document is what I should say. And it sends it to them and it says things like, hey, you're going to respect our privacy. If you have access to our clients' data, you're going to respect their privacy. And then right here in 9 in bold, we have it that they are signing off and saying, yep, we have, done the proper cybersecurity, audits in place for what we're working. We have cybersecurity insurance to cover such theft and all that. And then, down at the end, they simply have to sign off on it. So one of two things are going to happen. Excuse me. You're going to send this to them. They're going to sign it. You can tuck it into your compliance folder and move on with your life. And you've done your vendor due diligence. You've had them sign off that they agree to all this and that they're protecting your client data and that they've been through the cybersecurity agreements. Now, some of them will come back and say, hey, we're not comfortable signing this, but here's the documentation that we do have. And that may be, SOC reports or whatever kind of cybersecurity audits they've been through. Maybe they'll send you copies of their insurance policies, whatever the case may be. This letter, if they're not going to sign it, they should at least send you that documentation, and then you can go through that documentation and determine if they're meeting your standards and if you're okay with how they're approaching the topic. Now, if they come back and they say, hey, we're not going to sign this, and they're not going to give you any documentation, that's when you really have to stop and reconsider your use of that vendor because something isn't right. I can tell you right now, when I do, a penetration test, I'm potentially getting access to very sensitive information. I'm more than happy to turn over whatever documentation my clients need to have to feel comfortable with me, whether it's references or cybersecurity audits or background check, whatever, right? Like I want to make them comfortable because, I'm a vendor. I'm part of their due diligence when they hire me. If they're not willing to sign this document and they're not willing to turn over any of their other documents, you really have to stop and consider, do they have your privacy and cybersecurity in mind and your best interest in mind? So anyway, this is a great template. I found it to be just a great conversation starter if you need to go through and do that kind of work. The other thing I will mention is Smart RIA. I don't know if any of you guys are using Smart RIA, but I think it's a couple, maybe 6 months old now or something like that. But they came out with a data governance program, which is awesome. You basically log into this portal. You can type in what vendors you have, and it's going to automatically run reports for you, where it's the vendor attestations. If they have cybersecurity reports, they're going to pop up in here. So it's a really cool program. I've used it a good bit. It's super convenient. And I will give a shout out to Smart RIA. They are one of the few fintech firms that actually let me do a penetration test on them and test their systems, and they passed with flying colors. So that's why I'm happy to give them a recommendation. And they really make the vendor due diligence and that sort of thing super easy. So that's it, guys. I hope that helps a little bit and provides some clarity to what the SEC request. Give me a little bit of time. I'm going to have a recorded copy of this webinar that I'll send out to you. I'll also send out links to the community project where it's the different requests that the SEC has made. That's a great document for you to bookmark and check back with. I generally update it about once a month or so, or whenever I see a new request come in or they're requesting new information, but it's a great document to go through and triangulate what you're doing cybersecurity compliance wise and say, hey, could I actually answer this question? So I'll be sure to send that out, of course, so that you guys can access it. But again, guys, thank you so much for coming on. The only question I have right now is there be a copy of the slide deck? Yeah, absolutely. I'll pass that out. Video editing is not my forte, so it takes me a couple days to do that. So maybe Monday or Tuesday, look for a copy of that to come out to you, the email that you registered on. Of course, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can use that's my cell phone number or my email address. Either one works for me, and I'm definitely happy to spend some time talking through any particular issues that you might have or any questions that you might have. So again, guys, thank you so much for spending your Friday with me. I hope you all have an amazing weekend. I'm down in San Antonio. We're starting to get a little bit of cooler weather in here, so I'm excited about that. And I hope you guys have a good weather to get out and enjoy the outdoors with this weekend. So thanks again, guys.